The voicemail arrived at 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday. Emma's panicked voice crackled through the speaker as I rubbed sleep from my eyes. "Alex, something terrible has happened. I'm at Mount Hood with the hiking group, and there's been an accident. Emma, she fell from the cliff near Devil's Rest Trail. The rescue team can't find her body. I'm so sorry. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you." But here's the thing about tragedy. It has a way of revealing truth. As I stood there in my pajamas, phone trembling in my hand, I felt something I wasn't expecting. Relief. Not the kind of relief you'd expect from a grieving husband, but the relief of finally having confirmation of what I'd suspected for months. My wife hadn't died in a hiking accident. She'd orchestrated her own disappearance, and she'd done it remarkably well. What she didn't know was that I'd been 3 steps ahead of her the entire time. The call came from Dr. Patricia Wells, our family physician and Emma's longtime friend. From college, Patricia had always been overly protective of Emma, treating me like some kind of threat to her happiness. Over the years, I'd grown accustomed to her cold shoulder at dinner parties and the way she'd change subjects whenever I entered a room. What struck me as odd wasn't the tragedy itself, but the precision of the timing and circumstances. Emma had supposedly joined a hiking group she'd never mentioned before, on a trail she'd never expressed interest in exploring. During a weekend when she'd told me she was visiting her sister in Sacramento, the pieces didn't fit, but they painted a picture I'd been watching develop for months. My wife had been planning her escape, and she'd recruited our family doctor to help execute it, standing in our kitchen that morning, surrounded by the remnants of what had been our shared life. I allowed myself a moment of genuine reflection. Emma and I had been married for 8 years, together for 10. We'd met at a tech conference in San Francisco where she was promoting her marketing firm, and I was just starting to build my consulting business. She was brilliant, ambitious, and had a laugh that could light up any room she entered. For the first few years, we were genuinely happy. We bought our house in Lake Oswego, adopted a golden retriever named Charlie, talked about the future with the kind of optimism that only comes from being young and successful. But somewhere along the way, things shifted. Emma became distant, distracted. She started working longer hours, taking weekend trips for clients I never heard her mention during our dinner conversations. Phone calls that ended abruptly when I walked into the room. Text messages that made her smile in ways that had nothing to do with me. The signs were subtle at first, the kind of changes that could be explained away by work stress or the natural evolution of a long relationship. The first concrete evidence came 6 months ago when I was looking for our insurance documents in Emma's home office. Tucked between quarterly tax forms, I found printed emails from someone named Ryan Martinez, a photographer from Seattle. The emails were carefully worded, professional on the surface, but there was an intimacy in the language that made my stomach drop. References to our project, mentions of meetings that never appeared on the calendar Emma shared with me, and a closing line that read, "Until we can be together properly, E." I didn't confront her immediately. Instead, I did what any successful businessman would do. I gathered information. I hired a private investigator, a former police detective named Michael Rodriguez, who specialized in domestic cases. Within 3 weeks, Michael had provided me with a comprehensive report that painted a clear picture of Emma's double life. Ryan Martinez wasn't just a photographer. He was a successful commercial artist who owned a gallery in Seattle's Capitol Hill district. Emma had been traveling there twice a month for the past year, staying at boutique hotels under her maiden name, Martinez, and spending long weekends playing house with her lover. The investigation revealed that Emma and Ryan had been planning more than just an affair. They'd been researching ways to access my business assets, looking into the legal requirements for spousal inheritance, and exploring how to transfer funds internationally without triggering banking regulations. Email threads discussed, starting fresh and leaving the past behind. There were references to a new life in Portugal, where Ryan had family connections, and where American authorities would have limited jurisdiction. What they didn't know was that my business was structured in ways that protected both my personal assets and my company's intellectual property. Years of working with high net worth Clients had taught me the importance of financial planning and asset protection. Emma had access to our joint accounts and some investment portfolios, but the bulk of my wealth was held in trusts and business entities that would require significant legal hurdles to access. More importantly, Emma had no idea that I'd been documenting everything. Every unexplained absence, every suspicious phone call, every lie about weekend plans had been carefully recorded and corroborated. I'd installed monitoring software on our shared computer that tracked deleted files and browsing history. I dephotographed hotel receipts found in her car, documented the new clothes that appeared in her wardrobe, and maintained detailed logs of her changing behavior patterns. The morning of her supposed death, Emma had kissed me goodbye with the same casual affection she'd shown for months. She was dressed in expensive hiking gear I'd never seen before, carrying a backpack that looked barely used. Her explanation about joining Patricia's hiking group seemed rehearsed. She'd been unusually specific about their planned route and timeline. As she walked out the door, she'd paused to look back at our house with an expression I couldn't quite read at the time. Now I understood it had been her way of saying goodbye to the life she was abandoning. The subsequent phone call from Patricia felt like a poorly rehearsed performance. Her voice carried just enough emotion to seem believable, but there were details that didn't align with standard emergency procedures. She claimed the rescue team had called off the search due to dangerous conditions. Yet Mount Hood rescue operations typically continue for days unless weather becomes truly extreme. She mentioned that Emma's body had likely been swept downstream. But Devil's Rest Trail doesn't have significant water features that would support that theory. Most telling was Patricia's insistence that I shouldn't come to the scene immediately. She suggested I wait at home for official word from authorities, claiming that my presence would only complicate the rescue efforts. This advice contradicted everything I knew about emergency situations, where family members are typically contacted through official channels and encouraged to maintain close communication with rescue coordinators. As I hung up the phone that morning, I realized that Emma's carefully planned disappearance had one fatal flaw. She'd underestimated my intelligence and my capacity for patience. She'd assumed that 8 years of marriage had made me complacent, that success had made me soft, and that love had made me blind to her deception. She was wrong on all 3 counts. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat down at my kitchen table to wait for the next phase of her plan to unfold. Outside, Portland was waking up to another beautiful morning, and I found myself genuinely curious about how elaborate Emma's scheme would become. She'd managed to fake her own death with medical assistance, but now she'd have to navigate insurance, investigations, legal proceedings, and the scrutiny that comes with any suspicious disappearance. What she didn't know was that I'd been preparing for this moment for months. And unlike her hastily planned escape, my response would be methodical, comprehensive, and absolutely devastating. The official death certificate arrived exactly 1 week after Emma's supposed accident. Dr. Patricia Wells had signed it with the clinical precision of someone who'd done this before, listing the cause of death as accidental drowning following traumatic fall, and the location as Mount Hood National Forest, approximate coordinates, undetermined. What struck me wasn't the document itself, but the speed with which it had been processed. In Oregon, death certificates for missing persons typically require extensive waiting periods and multiple agency approvals. Patricia had somehow expedited the entire process through channels I didn't know existed. I spent that morning in my home office, methodically organizing the evidence I'd collected over the past 6 months. Financial records showed Emma had been gradually moving money from our joint savings account into a personal checking account I'd never seen statements for. Small transfers, never more than $3,000 at a time, carefully spaced to avoid triggering automatic bank notifications. The total amount stolen came to nearly $47,000 of our shared assets. Money I'd earned through late nights and weekend projects while she claimed to be building her freelance marketing career. Her laptop, which she'd left behind in what I assumed was an attempt to seem authentic, contained a browsing history that revealed months of careful planning. Searches for how long before a missing person declared dead. International money transfer regulations. and countries without U.S. extradition treaties painted a clear picture of someone researching more than just a simple disappearance. She'd been studying Portuguese immigration laws, researching rental properties in Lisbon, and even looking into how to obtain European citizenship through marriage. The most damning evidence came from her deleted email account, which my IT background allowed me to recover from our home server. Emma had been corresponding with Ryan Martinez for over 18 months, not the casual 6-month affair I'd initially suspected. Their relationship had evolved from professional collaboration to romantic involvement to elaborate criminal conspiracy. Ryan owned not just a gallery in Seattle, but also property investments in Portugal through a family trust. The emails revealed plans to liquidate my business assets, transfer the funds overseas, and establish new identities in Europe. What they hadn't counted on was my partnership with Sophie Chen, my business associate and the most pragmatic person I'd ever met. Sophie had been suspicious of Emma long before I'd admitted my own concerns. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. During a lunch meeting 2 months earlier, she'd mentioned Emma's unusual interest in our company's financial structure and her pointed questions about business valuations. During casual dinner conversations, Sophie had recommended discreetly restructuring our partnership agreement to protect against potential spousal claims, advice I'd initially dismissed as overly cautious. Now I understood that Sophie's instincts had been correct. Emma hadn't just been planning to disappear. She'd been positioning herself to claim widow's rights to my portion of the business. Under Oregon law, surviving spouses have significant claims on community property, including business interests acquired during marriage. Emma's fake death was intended to trigger probate proceedings that would give her legal access to assets she couldn't otherwise touch. Insurance angle became clear when I received a call from David Foster, an investigator with Cascade Insurance. Group David's tone was professional but probing as he explained the need to verify circumstances surrounding Emma's policy claim. She'd apparently increased her life insurance coverage to $500,000. Just 3 months before her disappearance, a detail she'd never mentioned during our regular financial planning discussions. The timing was suspicious enough to trigger automatic investigation protocols, which meant Emma's plan was already encountering obstacles she hadn't anticipated. During my meeting with David at his downtown Portland office, I learned that Emma's case wasn't the first suspicious claim his company had encountered involving Dr. Patricia Wells. 2 other patients had died under circumstances that seemed medically improbable, though neither case had generated enough evidence for criminal prosecution. Patricia had a reputation among insurance investigators as someone whose patients experienced unusually high rates of accidental death, particularly patients with substantial life insurance policies. This revelation shifted my understanding of Emma's plan entirely. She hadn't stumbled into this scheme through her relationship with Ryan Martinez. She'd been recruited by Patricia Wells, who was apparently running a sophisticated insurance fraud operation using her medical credentials to legitimize fake deaths. Emma was just the latest client in what appeared to be an ongoing criminal enterprise. I began monitoring Patricia's other activities, using the same investigative resources I'd employed to track Emma's affair. Within days, I discovered that Patricia maintained office addresses in 3 different states and had medical licenses that allowed her to practice across the Pacific Northwest. Her patient roster included several individuals who died in remote accidents over the past 5 years, all of whom had recently increased their life insurance coverage and all of whom had financial difficulties that would have motivated desperate measures. The sophistication of the operation became apparent when I learned that Patricia wasn't working alone. She'd partnered with a network of professionals, including lawyers who specialized in probate law, financial advisors who helped move assets internationally, and even contacts within state agencies who could expedite death certificates and other official documents. Emma had essentially hired a full-service disappearance company, paying them with money stolen from our joint accounts. What impressed me most was the psychological manipulation involved. Patricia had convinced Emma that I was somehow dangerous or threatening, justifying the elaborate deception as self-protection rather than theft. Email exchanges revealed that Patricia had spent months undermining Emma's perception of our marriage, suggesting that I was controlling, financially manipulative, and potentially violent. These accusations were based on completely fabricated evidence, including staged photographs and fictional witness statements, designed to make Emma believe she was in danger. The emotional manipulation extended to Ryan Martinez as well. He genuinely believed he was rescuing Emma from an abusive relationship, making him a willing accomplice rather than a calculated criminal. His gallery served as a legitimate front for money laundering operations, with expensive artwork purchases, providing cover for large cash transactions. Ryan's Portuguese connections weren't just family relationships. They were business partnerships specifically designed to move American assets beyond the reach of U.S. authorities. As the first pieced together the full scope of the conspiracy, I realized that Emma's fake death was just one component of a much larger criminal enterprise. Patricia Wells had been operating this scheme for years, targeting vulnerable individuals with substantial assets and convincing them that elaborate disappearances were their only path to safety and freedom. The success of her operation depended on victims who were intelligent enough to execute complex plans but desperate enough to ignore obvious risks. Emma fit the profile perfectly. She was educated, financially sophisticated, and increasingly dissatisfied with her life, but she lacked the criminal experience to recognize how thoroughly she was being manipulated. Patricia had identified Emma as an ideal target months before the affair with Ryan began. Using her position as our family doctor to assess our financial situation and marital stability, every aspect of Emma's plan, from the timing of the insurance policy increase to the location of her supposed accident, it's been carefully designed to maximize financial recovery while minimizing investigation risks. The most chilling discovery came when I found evidence that Patricia had been researching me as well. She'd compiled detailed profiles of my business interests, personal relationships, and psychological tendencies. Notes describe me as methodical, but predictable and unlikely to pursue aggressive investigation. She'd apparently concluded that I would accept Emma's death at face value and cooperate fully with insurance and legal proceedings, making me an unwitting accomplice in my own financial destruction. But Patricia had made the same mistake Emma had made throughout our marriage. She'd underestimated my intelligence, my resources, and most importantly, my capacity for strategic thinking. While she'd been researching my weaknesses, I'd been documenting her crimes. While Emma had been planning her escape, I'd been preparing my response. They'd assumed that love would make me blind, that grief would make me weak, and that shock would make me stupid. Instead, Emma's supposed death had freed me to take actions I couldn't have justified while she was alive. I no longer had to protect her reputation or worry about destroying our marriage. I could pursue justice without considering the impact on our shared social circle or her professional relationships. Her fake death had eliminated every constraint that had previously prevented me from exposing their criminal conspiracy. Now I intended to use that freedom to ensure that everyone involved faced appropriate consequences for their actions. The memorial service was scheduled for a Saturday morning at Willamette Valley Gardens, a peaceful venue overlooking the Columbia River. I'd chosen the location myself, explaining to concerned friends and colleagues that Emma would have loved the natural setting and panoramic views. What I didn't mention was that the venue's elevated position provided excellent sightlines for surveillance, and its single-access road made it impossible for anyone to arrive or leave without being observed. Sophie Chen had questioned my decision to hold a public memorial for someone whose body hadn't been recovered, suggesting that a private gathering might be more appropriate given the circumstances. Her concern was genuine, but misplaced. I needed this event to be highly visible, well-attended, and emotionally compelling. The memorial wasn't about honoring Emma's memory. It was about creating the perfect trap for the people who'd helped her orchestrate this elaborate deception. I'd spent weeks crafting the guest list with surgical precision. Every invitation served a strategic purpose, from Emma's college friends who might provide information about Patricia Wells' history, to business associates who could testify about Emma's recent behavior and financial questions. I'd also invited several people who didn't know they were being invited for investigative purposes, including Ryan Martinez's business partners from Seattle and Patricia. Wells medical school classmates who now practiced in Portland. The morning of the service, I stood in my bathroom, adjusting a perfectly knotted black tie and reviewing my mental checklist one final time. Hidden cameras positioned throughout the venue would record every interaction, every conversation, and every emotional response from attendees. Audio recording devices, legally placed in public areas, would capture discussions that might reveal additional details about the conspiracy. Most importantly, I'd arranged for undercover investigators to attend as mourners, positioned to identify and track anyone whose presence seemed suspicious or out of place. Patricia Wells arrived exactly 30 minutes before the scheduled start time, dressed in conservative black attire that projected appropriate grief while maintaining her professional medical image. Her behavior was textbook manipulation, approaching me with just the right combination of sympathy and clinical detachment. She squeezed my shoulder gently and spoke in the measured tones of someone accustomed to delivering difficult news to families in crisis. "Alex, I want you to know how proud I am of your strength through this terrible ordeal," Patricia said, her voice carrying that particular cadence that medical professionals use when discussing terminal diagnoses. "Emma always told me what a supportive husband you were, even when she was struggling with her own challenges. She was lucky to have someone who understood her need for independence and adventure." The irony was remarkable. Patricia was simultaneously expressing sympathy for my loss, while subtly reinforcing the narrative that Emma's death was somehow connected to character traits I'd supposedly supported. Every word was calculated to make me feel responsible for enabling the very behavior that had led to this tragedy. A psychological manipulation designed to prevent me from questioning the circumstances too closely. I responded with exactly the kind of vulnerable gratitude Patricia was expecting. "Thank you, Patricia. I keep thinking about all the things I could have done differently, all the signs I might have missed." She seemed so excited about that hiking group you'd organized. I wish I'd paid more attention to her outdoor interests. The test worked perfectly. Patricia's expression flickered almost imperceptibly, a micro-expression of confusion that revealed she hadn't expected me to reference a hiking group she'd supposedly organized. Her recovery was smooth, but not immediate, and that brief hesitation told me everything I needed to know about her improvisational abilities under pressure. "Well, you know, Emma," Patricia replied, her tone becoming slightly more cautious. She was always drawn to new experiences, sometimes without fully considering the risks involved. The hiking community can be very welcoming, perhaps too welcoming for someone without extensive wilderness experience. Throughout the service, I maintained the perfect balance of grief and composure that would allow me to observe without appearing calculating. I delivered a eulogy that painted Emma as adventurous and independent, while subtly emphasizing aspects of her personality that would support the official narrative of accidental death. Every word was designed to make the attendees believe I was a devoted husband struggling with loss, simultaneously gathering information about their connections to Emma's disappearance. The breakthrough came during the reception when Lisa Parker, Emma's college roommate, approached me with tears in her eyes and a story that didn't match the official timeline. Lisa had driven down from Seattle specifically for the memorial, and she'd brought with her a different version of Emma's final weeks that contradicted everything Patricia had told me about the circumstances leading to the supposed accident. "Alex, I feel terrible that I didn't call you sooner," Lisa said, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue that had already seen significant use. "Emma came to visit me 3 weeks ago, and she seemed so different. She was excited about some new opportunity, talking about traveling to Europe and starting fresh somewhere exotic. She made it sound like you two had discussed taking a sabbatical together, maybe spending a year abroad while your business was doing so well." This was the first I'd heard of any conversation about European travel or sabbaticals. Emma had never mentioned Portugal, never expressed interest in extended international trips, and certainly hadn't discussed any plans that would involve stepping away from our respective careers. Lisa's account suggested that Emma had been testing different versions of her departure story. It's probably to gauge which narrative would seem most believable to people who knew us well. More significant was Lisa's description of Emma's emotional state during that visit. Rather than appearing troubled or fearful, as Patricia's manipulation would have required. Emma had seemed energetic and optimistic about the future. She'd talked about new relationships and exciting possibilities, behavior that was completely inconsistent with someone planning to fake their own death to escape domestic danger. She kept checking her phone and smiling at messages. Lisa continued. Apparently unaware of how damaging her observations were to the official story, I teased her about having a secret admirer. She just laughed and said she was finally getting the attention she deserved. I assumed she was talking about some new client or professional opportunity. But now I wonder if there was someone special she hadn't told you about yet. I absorbed this information while maintaining the appropriate expression of confused grief. Lisa's account proved that Emma had been planning this deception for weeks. It's not responding to sudden danger as Patricia's manipulation would have suggested. More importantly, confirmed that Emma had been communicating regularly with Ryan Martinez and probably coordinating the final details of their escape plan during those same 3 weeks. The most revealing moment came when Ryan Martinez himself appeared at the memorial, having driven down from Seattle, ostensibly to pay his respects to someone he claimed to have barely known. His presence was a tactical error that demonstrated how poorly he understood the psychological aspects of criminal deception. An innocent business acquaintance might send flowers or a condolence card, but wouldn't make a 3-hour drive to attend the memorial service of someone they'd supposedly met only professionally. Ryan's behavior throughout the service was a masterclass in guilty body language. He avoided eye contact, positioned himself away from other attendees, and seemed more interested in observing the crowd than participating in the ceremony. When I approached him during the reception to thank him for coming, his nervousness was immediately apparent. "I'm so sorry for your loss, Alex," he said, extending a hand that was slightly damp with perspiration. "Emma spoke about you often during our professional consultations. She was very proud of your business success and seemed genuinely happy with your life together here in Portland." The phrasing was wrong in multiple ways. People don't typically discuss their spouses during brief professional consultations, and Emma had never mentioned Ryan's name or shown any particular pride in my business achievements during recent conversations. More tellingly, Ryan's reference to our life together here in Portland suggested familiarity with details about our relationship that wouldn't have come up in legitimate business contexts. I decided to test Ryan's knowledge by asking about the specific marketing projects he'd supposedly worked on with Emma. His responses were vague and contradictory, referencing types of photography that didn't align with his actual artistic focus and mentioning deadlines that didn't correspond to any work Emma had claimed to be doing during the relevant time periods. Within minutes, it became clear that Ryan knew far more about Emma's personal life than he could have learned through professional interaction, but far less about her supposed marketing career than any legitimate business partner would know. The final confrontation of the day came when Patricia Wells attempted to solidify her version of events by pulling me aside for what she probably intended as a supportive conversation about moving forward after tragedy. Her timing was perfect from an investigative standpoint, because I had already identified the inconsistencies in both her story and Ryan's presence, allowing me to approach this conversation with complete confidence in my position. "Alex, I want to make sure you're taking care of yourself during this difficult transition," Patricia began, using the same clinical tone she'd employed earlier. "Grief can manifest in many ways, including sometimes making us question things that we'd normally accept without hesitation. It's completely natural to wonder about what-if scenarios or to imagine that different choices might have prevented this tragedy." She was preemptively addressing the possibility that I might develop suspicions about Emma's death, tempting to frame any investigation as psychological instability rather than legitimate inquiry. The approach was sophisticated, but ultimately revealed how much she feared the possibility of my getting closer to the truth about their conspiracy. I looked directly into her eyes and smiled with the kind of genuine warmth that comes from finally understanding exactly how much someone has underestimated your intelligence. "Patricia, I appreciate your concern more than you know. Emma was fortunate to have such a dedicated friend willing to go to extraordinary lengths to help her through difficult times. I'm sure she would be grateful to know how much effort you've put into making sure her story is told exactly the way she would have wanted." The words were carefully chosen to sound like gratitude while actually communicating that I knew exactly what she'd done and exactly how she'd done it. Patricia's reaction was immediate and unmistakable. Her face went completely pale, her hands trembled slightly, and for just a moment, her carefully maintained professional composure cracked entirely. Recovered quickly, but not before I'd seen the fear in her eyes and understood that she finally realized how badly she'd misjudged the situation. The memorial service had accomplished exactly what I had intended. It had drawn all the conspirators into the open, documented their lies and inconsistencies, and most importantly, it had let them know that their carefully planned deception was about to unravel completely. The phone call I'd been waiting for came exactly 2 weeks after the memorial service. Emma's voice was different now, softer, and more hesitant than I remembered, but unmistakably her. She was calling from an international number, probably somewhere in Europe based on the digital delay and connection quality. What she said next confirmed everything I'd suspected about her amateur approach to this entire scheme. "Alex, please don't hang up. I know this must be incredibly shocking, but I need you to listen to me." Her voice carried a trembling quality. That suggested she was genuinely emotional, not just performing. "I'm alive, obviously, and I'm so sorry for putting you through this. I never wanted to hurt you, but I felt trapped and didn't know any other way out." I let the silence stretch for several seconds, allowing her to interpret my lack of response as stunned disbelief rather than calculated patience. When I finally spoke, my voice carried exactly the right mixture of confusion, relief, and hurt that any normal husband would feel upon learning his supposedly dead wife was actually alive and living overseas with her lover. "Emma, this is impossible. Patricia said you fell from the cliff. The rescue team searched for days. I held a memorial service. How are you calling me right now?" I made sure to sound breathless, overwhelmed by the impossibility of what I was hearing. "I know how this must sound, but please let me explain. I was with Ryan when the accident was supposed to happen. We'd been planning to disappear together, to start fresh somewhere we could be happy. Patricia helped us stage everything because she understood how desperate I'd become." Emma's confession was tumbling out faster than she could control, revealing the emotional stress of maintaining such an elaborate deception. The interesting thing about Emma's call was how much it revealed about the current state of their carefully planned escape. She was calling from what sounded like a stressful environment, with background noise suggesting she was in a public place rather than the romantic Portuguese hideaway they'd supposedly been preparing for months. Oh, more tellingly, she was calling alone, without Ryan's voice or presence, which suggested their relationship was already experiencing the strain that typically destroys partnerships built on criminal conspiracy. "I need you to understand that this wasn't about money or wanting to hurt you," Emma continued, her voice becoming more desperate as she realized. "I wasn't responding with the forgiveness or relief she'd apparently expected. I felt like I was disappearing in our marriage, like I'd lost myself completely. Ryan made me feel alive again, and Patricia convinced me that starting over was the only way to find happiness." I recognized the language pattern immediately. These weren't Emma's natural phrases or typical way of expressing emotional concepts. Patricia Wells had obviously spent considerable time coaching Emma on how to frame her betrayal as victimization, teaching her to describe theft and fraud as self-actualization. The psychological manipulation was sophisticated, but it revealed how thoroughly Patricia had studied the dynamics of abusive relationships to create a convincing narrative that would justify Emma's crimes. "Where are you now, Emma? Are you safe? I've been going crazy wondering what happened to you." I injected just enough concern into my voice to sound like a husband genuinely worried about his wife's well-being, while internally cataloging every piece of information her call was providing about their current situation. "I'm in Lisbon with Ryan. We found a small apartment near the old city. Ryan's been trying to establish his art business here. But Alex, things aren't working out the way we planned. The money we brought isn't lasting as long as we expected. And Ryan's family connections weren't as helpful as he thought they'd be." The admission was significant because it confirmed that their criminal enterprise was already failing, probably due to the same poor planning and amateur execution that had characterized the entire scheme from the beginning. More importantly, Emma's tone suggested she was having second thoughts about the entire plan, not because she'd developed a conscience about the crimes she'd committed, because the reality of living as a fugitive wasn't matching the romantic fantasy Patricia had sold her. This was the moment I'd been waiting for. The opportunity to begin reversing the entire situation by offering Emma exactly what she thought she wanted while simultaneously ensuring she faced consequences for her actions. Emma, I'm just so relieved. You're alive. Nothing else matters right now. You're not happy there. If things aren't working out with Ryan, you can always come home. We can work through this together, figure out how to rebuild what we had. My offer was carefully calculated to sound genuine, while actually being completely impossible to fulfill given the legal complications Emma had created through her fake death. The silence on Emma's end lasted long enough that I began to wonder if the connection had been lost. When she finally responded, her voice was thick with tears and what sounded like genuine regret. Alex, I've made such terrible mistakes. I let Patricia convince me that you were somehow holding me back, that our marriage was preventing me from becoming who I was supposed to be. But being here with Ryan, trying to build something from nothing, has made me realize what I actually lost. This was the confirmation I'd been hoping for. Emma was ready to abandon Ryan Martinez and return to the life she'd tried to escape. But she didn't understand that her fake death had created legal complications that made simple reconciliation impossible. She couldn't just come home and pretend. The fraud had never happened, especially given the insurance claims and official death certificate that were now part of the public record. I want to see you, Alex. I want to come home and try to make this right, but I'm scared about the legal problems I might have created. Patricia told me that staging my death was the only way to get out cleanly, but now I'm realizing she might not have thought through all the consequences. Emma's admission revealed that she was beginning to understand how thoroughly she'd been manipulated by Patricia, but she still didn't grasp the full scope of the criminal charges she was facing. The conversation continued for nearly an hour, with Emma gradually revealing more details about her current situation and her growing desperation to escape the consequences of her own choices. Ryan had apparently become increasingly controlling and paranoid, convinced that American authorities were tracking them through financial transactions and electronic communications. Their relationship was deteriorating rapidly under the stress of living as fugitives. Emma was beginning to realize that she'd traded a comfortable marriage for a precarious exile with someone she barely knew outside of their affair. Most significantly, Emma revealed that Patricia Wells had been pressuring them to recruit additional clients for what she described as liberation services, essentially asking Emma to help identify other wealthy individuals who might be convinced to fake their own deaths for insurance money. This confirmed that Patricia was running a sophisticated criminal enterprise that extended far beyond Emma's case, and it provided the evidence I'd need to ensure that all the co-conspirators faced appropriate legal consequences. The phone call ended with Emma begging me to find a way for her to return home safely, promising to do whatever was necessary to make amends for the pain she'd caused. I assured her that I would research the legal options and contact her again soon with a plan for resolving the situation. What I didn't tell her was that I'd already spent weeks coordinating with law enforcement agencies and had been recording our entire conversation with their full knowledge and approval. Detective James Carter had been tracking the Patricia Wells investigation for months before Emma's case brought everything into focus. James was a methodical investigator who specialized in complex fraud cases, and he'd been building a comprehensive file on Patricia's criminal network that now included evidence from multiple jurisdictions. Emma's phone call had provided the final piece of evidence needed to obtain international arrest warrants and begin the process of shutting down the entire operation. The next phase of my response required coordination between local law enforcement, federal agencies, and international authorities in Portugal. Emma and Ryan had made themselves vulnerable by using electronic communications and financial transactions that could be traced through international banking systems. Their amateur approach to living as fugitives had created a digital trail that made them easy to locate and monitor, especially once they'd reestablished contact with people in the United States. Within days of Emma's phone call, I received confirmation that Portuguese authorities had identified their location and were coordinating with American law enforcement to execute arrests. The timing would be critical because we needed to apprehend all the co-conspirators simultaneously to prevent any of them from escaping or destroying evidence. Patricia Wells was still operating her medical practice in Portland, apparently confident that Emma's successful disappearance proved the viability of her criminal methods. The most satisfying aspect of the entire investigation was realizing how completely the conspirators had underestimated the resources available to someone with my business background and financial connections. They'd assumed that Emma's fake death would leave me too devastated and confused to mount an effective response. But instead, it had freed me to pursue justice without any of the personal constraints that had previously prevented me from taking decisive action. Emma had called, expecting to find a grieving husband desperate for reconciliation, someone who would be grateful enough for her survival to overlook the crimes she'd committed. Instead, she'd discovered that her supposed victim had spent weeks building an airtight case against everyone involved in her deception, and that her emotional manipulation would only serve as additional evidence of the psychological techniques Patricia Wells had taught her to use against her own husband. The irony was perfect. In trying to escape the life she'd built with me, Emma had walked directly into a trap that would ensure she faced consequences far more severe than anything she'd tried to avoid. Her fake death was about to become the evidence that destroyed not just her freedom, but the freedom of everyone who'd helped her orchestrate this elaborate betrayal. The arrests happened simultaneously across 3 time zones on a Tuesday morning in March. Patricia Wells was taken into custody at her Portland medical office while conducting what she believed was a routine patient consultation. Ryan Martinez was arrested at a cafe in Lisbon's Barro Alto district, where he'd been meeting with potential investors for his struggling gallery business. Emma was detained at the small apartment they'd been sharing, apparently caught completely off guard by the coordinated international operation that had been tracking their movements for weeks. I watched the Portland arrest from my office downtown, having been invited by Detective James Carter to observe as Patricia's criminal empire finally collapsed. The scene was remarkably anticlimactic for something that represented months of investigation and years of criminal activity. Patricia simply stood up from her desk, removed her white coat with practiced efficiency, and allowed herself to be handcuffed without protest or dramatics. The evidence seized from Patricia's office painted a complete picture of the fraud operation she'd been running. Financial records showed she'd helped orchestrate at least 12 fake deaths over the past 5 years, generating millions of dollars in fraudulent insurance claims. Her client files read like a catalog of desperate people who'd been convinced that elaborate disappearances were preferable to dealing with debt, divorce, or business failures. What struck me most about Patricia's operation was how systematically she'd preyed on people during vulnerable moments in their lives. Every victim had been going through financial stress, relationship problems, or career difficulties when Patricia approached them with her solution. She'd positioned herself as a sympathetic medical professional, offering hope to people who felt trapped by circumstances beyond their control. Emma's case had been particularly lucrative because of the substantial life insurance policy and my business assets, but it had also been Patricia's downfall, unlike her previous victims who'd been genuinely isolated and desperate. Emma had maintained connections to people who could verify inconsistencies in her story. More importantly, she'd targeted someone with the resources and intelligence to mount a sophisticated investigation. The international extradition process moved faster than I'd expected, probably due to the clear evidence of financial crimes that crossed multiple jurisdictions. Within 6 weeks, both Emma and Ryan were back in Portland, facing federal charges that carried potential sentences of 15 to 20 years in prison. Their romantic European adventure had lasted less than 3 months, ending not with the liberation they'd imagined, but with federal marshals escorting them off a commercial airliner in shackles. I attended Emma's arraignment hearing, sitting in the public gallery where she could see me, but we couldn't interact directly. Her appearance had changed dramatically during her brief time as a fugitive. The confident, polished woman who'd kissed me goodbye that morning had been replaced by someone who looked exhausted, frightened, and much older than her 34 years. When Emma's eyes met mine across the courtroom, her expression cycled through surprise, relief, and finally, understanding as she realized I'd been orchestrating her capture from the beginning. There was no anger in her face, which surprised me. Instead, She seemed almost grateful to finally be facing consequences that would end the stress and uncertainty of life as a criminal fugitive. The plea negotiations revealed just how thoroughly Patricia Wells had manipulated her victims. Emma's defense attorney argued that she'd been psychologically coerced into participating in crimes she never would have considered under normal circumstances. The argument had merit, but it didn't excuse the months of theft, fraud, deception that Emma had enthusiastically embraced once Patricia provided the framework. Ryan Martinez received the harshest sentence, 12 years in federal prison. Because his art gallery had been used to launder money from multiple insurance fraud schemes, his family connections in Portugal had made him valuable to Patricia's operation. But they also made him responsible for facilitating international financial crimes that carried enhanced penalties. Emma ultimately accepted a plea agreement that resulted in an 8-year sentence in exchange for her cooperation in prosecuting Patricia Wells and providing information about other potential victims. Her testimony was crucial in dismantling the entire network, ensuring that Patricia received a 25-year sentence that would effectively end her criminal career. The financial recovery process was more complex than I'd anticipated. The insurance companies wanted to reclaim the death benefits they'd paid. My business had to be restructured to account for assets that had been frozen during the investigation. And Emma's portion of our community property had to be calculated against the restitution she owed for her crimes. Ultimately, I recovered most of what had been stolen, plus damages and legal fees that were paid from the liquidation of Patricia's assets. The house in Lake Oswego was sold, partly because it held too many memories of deception, but mostly because I wanted to start completely fresh, without any remnants of the life Emma and I had built together. Sophie Chen became my full business partner, taking over Emma's former role in our financial planning while bringing a level of integrity and loyalty that I'd clearly been missing. Our company expanded significantly over the following year, probably because the criminal case had generated publicity that established my reputation for thorough investigation and strategic thinking. 2 years later, I received a letter from Emma at the Federal Correctional Institution where she was serving her sentence. The letter was surprisingly thoughtful and reflective, acknowledging not just the crimes she'd committed, but the deeper character flaws that had made Patricia's manipulation possible. Wrote about the therapy she'd been receiving and her plans for rebuilding her life after release. I didn't respond to Emma's letter, not out of anger or resentment, but because I genuinely moved beyond the need for closure or reconciliation. Her fake death had accomplished something she'd never intended. It had freed me completely from any obligation to consider her feelings, protect her reputation, or compromise my own interests for the sake of our relationship. The most valuable lesson from the entire experience was understanding how completely I'd underestimated my own capacity for strategic patience. For years, I'd tolerated Emma's disrespect and deception because I'd believed that love required compromise and forgiveness. Her fake death had shown me that some betrayals are too fundamental to forgive, and some people are too damaged to save. Emma had wanted to disappear from her old life and start fresh with someone new. In the end, I'd made that wish come true in ways she never could have imagined. She'd disappeared from her comfortable existence and started over in a federal prison, while I'd built the new life she'd been dreaming of just without her in it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Click and check them out.